Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I mean, essentially, this talk is really about the future of futurology, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And for the last 100 years, it appears that the future, as Tim Lebrecht says, has been stuck in a permanent beta phase of development. Many futuristic products, vividly imagined in science fiction terms, have never really made it to commercial circulation. Or if so, they've been damp squids. And it asks us, where did the future go? And the future is many things. It's an ideal, it's an ambition, it's a delayed gratification, a story, a strategy, an inequality, or even a promise. And this talk explores how our idea about the future is changing from a 20th century paradigm to a 21st century one. And it examines the kinds of opportunities that that this shift presents us with. And I'll also discuss how this different approach may be harnessed through an applied practice of design fiction, fully well knowing that the term is probably striking fear into the hearts of serious commercial practitioners and scientists. And essentially what I'm going to propose is that the future has become a science, and actually we need to be much more interdisciplinary about our applications of the ideas that we are developing. Predicting the future is an ancient art, but in modern times it has become an increasingly scientific practice. Writing for the New York Review of Books, Robert L. Heilbromer remarks on the scientific bias we lavish on our approach to the future. For example, when the US government commissioned the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to report on the year 2000, they assembled a group of experts, which were 75% scientists, and actually the rest of them were social scientists and natural scientists, and there was no representation from artists, writers, architects, or businessmen on the committee. Over the course of the 20th century, we've gradually chained our imaginations to a rational instrument, which is goal-orientated. Science strives to satisfy our desires and fantasies through the processes of industrial production. And we are now familiar with the idea that our future can not only be engineered, but also mass manufactured. We are indeed, in some ways, living in a brave new world. Our lives are entangled in a commercial production system that invites us to invent our way towards a desirable future. So we fetishize evolving new products by consuming them, as it's the closest we can possibly be to realizing these coveted futures. As such, we are devouring our world in an act that Paul Hawken describes as stealing the future, selling it in the present, and calling it GDP. Indeed, our modern concepts of the future are so scientifically biased and steeped in industrial technologies that our current ideas about it have come to share many of the qualities of classical science, which has shaped the modern age. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll refer to classical science as 20th century science, as it adopts a particular view of the world that is very familiar to us. 20th century science views reality as a series of geometrically describable objects and organizes them in terms of hierarchies. 20th century science then takes these mathematical principles, calls them natural law, and uses them to extrapolate and predict a future. Now, this gives us a deterministic worldview, since once the calculations have been made, they cannot be shaped by external occurrences, and therefore the outcome is fixed. Yet, although this deterministic viewpoint is unchanging, it's not an absolute truth, since it relies on what we already know in order to make the initial projections of our needs. And these decisions are based on what we already believe to be true right now. So, for example, when aeroplanes and automobiles were emerging, new technologies were predicted, quite logically, to be something along the lines of flying cars. And as people predicted these, they were actually right. And now flying cars don't litter our aerial highways as imagined in The Fifth Element, but a number of flying cars have been developed, Indeed, a new generation of airborne private craft is now on the way. These are less like automobiles and more like small light aircraft that are roadworthy. And whilst these vehicles with their folding wings look like they'd be a great idea for the open spaces, say in the American West or the Australian outback, they're a little bit more challenging to imagine their application in a jam-packed megacity. But just like the adage that money can't buy us happiness, getting the future we want as a set of fetishized products is equally disappointing. In fact, science fiction author Warren Ellis notes that our idea of the future is becoming a banal Ballardian fantasy, which he proposes is the consequence of not getting the future that we were promised, or getting it too late to make the proposed difference. Indeed, flying cars in particular have actually become iconic symbols of our growing dissatisfaction in a commoditized future, since their realization has not changed the way we live. Yet 20th century consumerism has taught us to expect our dreams to be delivered almost as fast as we can imagine them. Push buttons, instant gratification, disposability have all become order of the day. Our future has become productized, and it's a moving target. And the further away we speculate from the desired future, the more likely we're to get the prediction wrong. Tomorrow's World, I don't know how many people remember Tomorrow's World, but Tomorrow's World presenter Maggie Philbin observed that the highly popular futures-orientated programme, which ran on BBC One from 1965 to 2003, anticipated the breathalyzer, the bucking bronco, the camcorder, cash machines, fibre optics, GPS, hovercraft, home computing, CCTV, compact discs, the fax machine, the digital watch and digital camera. But other products, such as Worms's food, the floating bicycle, paper underpants, waterproof paper, the sheep shearing robot, the snooker playing robot, the portable bath, the paper suit, the glow-in-the-dark fishing rod, interplanetary etiquette, pills for an all-chemical meal, centrally heated ski poles, squash ball warmers, real plants that double as television aerials, totally crashed and burned. However, Philbin notes that the biggest invention they did not foresee was the internet. The systemic changes that were made possible from linking computers together simply could not be anticipated by a culture that was entrenched in the idea of itemized products. Venture capitalist Steve Jurvetson, managing director at Draper Fisher Jurvetson, who specializes in disruptive technologies, notes that disruptive innovation does not come from marginal improvement buried deep in some large company, but always from startups. He states that the most important company 20 years from now has not even been founded yet and does not even have a name. Google and Facebook did not exist 20 years ago, but how their future success could have been predicted is not at all clear. Today, these futures horizons, which we cannot see beyond, are called singularities. They are algorithmic blind spots in deterministic thinking, which have been made famous through inventor Ray Kurzweil's notion of the singularity, where machine intelligence exceeds our own. Yet the potential for radical disruption is especially true at the start of the 21st century, where the advent of the internet has brought about so much technological, disciplinary, and cultural convergence. So is there a way of looking forwards rather than back to the future? The idea of futures if it's become a scientific practice, then perhaps an alternative scientific framework to classical science may help us open up spaces in which we can start to reflect what we mean by the future in different ways. And what might the future look like if it didn't begin with the premise of simplifying complex variables, but remained open and sensitive to our ever-changing cultural and environmental contexts? A new kind of science and cultural framework, which has only really become part of scientific practice in the latter part of the 20th century, and even now is still a marginal viewpoint, is offering us a new way of conceptualizing reality. This science is shaped around the principles of general systems theory or complexity and deals with relationships, networks and flows rather than science's object-centered hierarchies. And networks and flows are never fixed. They're always under construction. And we can think of this way of thinking as a 21st century kind of science, which empowers us with the creative freedom not to fix our ideas at some imaginary point in the future, but to actually shape events as we encounter them. And in this way, the future becomes an unevenly distributed present that we can shape by changing the context and conditions of events. And this enables us to adopt an open approach to the development of ideas, which can continually evolve as their outcomes are not fixed from the outset. And just to highlight the differences in thinking between the 20th and 21st century scientific paradigms, I've just got a diagram here, really, that enables us to compare and contrast. So, for example, if I start down in the bottom right-hand corner here, so 20th century science works around the principles of machines, which is founded on a set of philosophies by René Descartes, so it gives rise to Cartesian thinking. It also gives us the idea that things are either possible or impossible, such as dualistic thinking. And in contrast, though, the complexity gives us a metaphor for thinking, which is actually closer to an ecology than it is about a machine. And it also gives rise to constructed events, which I've called their impossible events, ones which are emergent from the system itself, rather than predicted or are made impossible by an algorithm. Also in 20th century science, we've actually got a deterministic worldview that operates through hard control systems, which is imposing order on systems, which are obviously environmentally belligerent. Whereas 21st century thinking looks at soft control systems that are probabilistic in their nature and environmentally sensitive. And I guess to link to the talk about patents, with 20th century thinking, that because everything is so fixed, you have a specialist worldview and you actually seek ideas protection. Whereas in a 21st century framework, you're looking at more collaborative kinds of practices and open source environments. And those are essentially the different, I guess, conceptual geographies of these particular worldviews. Now, just to be completely clear, we need both kinds of science. The point is that the different approaches have very particular challenges, opportunities, and outcomes. So we're already diversifying the kinds of instruments that we can use when we're thinking about the future. And if our 20th century approach to the future has been founded on a deterministic worldview that is typical of a classical science, then perhaps a 21st century worldview based on complexity will enable a different kind of approach. Now, since there are many differences between these different perspectives, 20th and 21st century science, can you see some of these slides? It's not really a hugely important one, they're just some ants crawling around some fluid beads there. Changing our reality frameworks will not only bring about the change in the way that we understand the future, but also in the way that we engage it. And since science is embodied in technology, I'm just going to have a bit of a compare and contrast about what a 20th century technology is and what a 21st century technology is. So we're all familiar with the idea of a 20th century technology. It's based on the idea of a machine, which is a series of inert objects that are ordered in a linear system according to a hierarchy. Now, because the objects are inert, we need to apply external energy to the system in order for it to perform useful work. So, for example, here, fossil fuel will be burnt to provide energy that drives a piston, that powers a crankshaft, that turns the wheels of a vehicle around an axle. So what does a 21st century technology look like? One that is using the metaphor of ecology. Well, ecology can actually be used to solve problems. I mean, we normally encounter it as a descriptive practice, but once we start to operationalize its relationships to solve challenges, then we can actually start to consider technologies that may actually work that are sensitive to their context and their environments. Now, ecological technologies do not formally exist in practice, so we need to make them. And essentially, we can describe ecological technologies in a term that was inspired by Alan Turing's interest in the computational powers of nature as a form of natural computing. And I'll explore some of these possibilities later in the talk through projects such as Future Venice, which is a proposal to grow an artificial limestone reef underneath the city. But these platforms are real. These natural computing platforms are real. They exist in a range of research environments right now. So this is, for example, a soft robotic droplet that's being developed at Martin Hanzuk's laboratory at the Southern University of Denmark. We have people like Andrew Adamatsky working on slime mold computing, which was, I think, was widely publicized to have predicted things like transport systems within Tokyo. And Lee Cronin's work, who was working on artificial inorganic chemical cells. So essentially, I think of these platforms really as being the operating systems for future ecological technologies and that are environmentally sensitive. And just to show you that they are very different phenomenologically to machines, I'll just use a series of droplets that I've been working on as a technology just to exemplify some principles. So I think it's actually quite difficult to see here, but essentially the first point is that ecological technologies are not manufactured, they're self-assembled. Here we have a droplet of alkali being added to an oil field, and as you know, that's a process of saponification. But the process itself is extremely vigorous, and when I was looking at an old recipe by Otto Bütschli, which was first described about 1898, it was striking how lifelike the behaviour of the saponifying system was. And it starts to suggest that we can start to think of 21st century technologies using a different set of ideas and language to how we would normally describe a machine. So here we can think of these droplets actually not being objects, but actually being agents, because they don't need external energy applied to the system. They're actually empowered through a chemical process to actually act. Interestingly as well, they start to cooperate and form what could be described as assemblages, which are cooperating groups that are reversibly interactive. Now, what's very interesting about this is that these droplets are actually relatively stable. You may think that something like this could never be used as a technology because the system is fundamentally complex and it's obviously very dynamic. However, this system here is actually remarkably robust. And I guess it's a bit like making a cake. You can put your eggs and your flour and your sugar and butter together, you put it in an oven, and you know, even before you take it out of the oven, that it's going to exist within a probabilistic range of products, ranging from the dirty old black biscuit, which is what I normally make, to the fantastic gâteau, which my grandmother makes. And so we can actually start to think about a different kind of technological platform as a way of showing how these different frameworks can produce qualitatively different kinds of ways of thinking and engaging with process and also, with ideas about the future. Now, with these ecological technologies, although they are relatively predictable within limits, they do actually not necessarily break down, but they can surprise us at what we'd call tipping points. And in this movie here, we're about to see a tipping point being reached. So all these droplets were created underneath the same set of conditions as the darkness is an oil field. These are microstructures, soapy microstructures that are being built. And the bright white areas are actually droplets that have been created about a millimetre in diameter. So they're actually much, much larger than biological systems. And when the home team and the away team meet, there's this scuffle in the middle. And through complex, possibly cybernetic kinds of feed-forward feedback systems, we actually see a qualitative change in the movement and the form of these droplets so that they completely do something else. And this is actually of great interest to us as to exactly how tipping points are formed. But once we know that they are formed, that there is no going back on the system. Now, that's really just a way of describing the kinds of principles that, say, for example, an ecological 21st century technology might possess. But the thing is that that's no good just to be spontaneous. We've got to be able to interact with that at a human scale. And so I've been able to do this in this particular system by adding minerals to the droplets, which enables them to produce carbonate in the presence of dissolved carbon dioxide. Very simple interaction. But also I tried scaling them up by using chemotaxis, so adding organic substances to the medium. And these droplets absolutely love alcohol. They swarm towards it, and then they become actually rapidly very, very quiet and inert. And in this particular experiment here, I managed to scale up the droplets by slowing down the whole metabolism. It didn't stop them from working. It just gave a qualitatively different kind of result, where the droplets were now able to build crystals within their bodies. And here we've got magnetite growing along alongside some calcium carbonate. So I was trying to work with kind of messier systems in order to create multiple products within this kind of 21st century technology environment. And what was quite interesting is that I could scale up the actions of this technology even further by entangling it with other technologies. So this is a collaboration with architect Philip Beasley for the 2010 Venice Architecture Biennale. And this is one of the vials that I created a little environment for these dynamic chemistries. And I think of them really as being smell or taste systems, because they could detect the presence of carbon dioxide, which got dissolved into the flasks. And then gradually, throughout the 3 months of the installation, these droplets gradually change colour. In this particular case, from a blue copper sulfate to a green copper carbonate. So what's interesting about these technologies is that they start to give us an idea of what a probabilistic future might look like. Because we use the machine and classical science so much in terms of our thinking, it already influences outcomes before we ever really explore some of these convergent ideas and convergent systems. So if our 20th and 21st century technologies are distinct, then it seems reasonable to propose that this will also be true of the kind of future that they suggest. And so I think this becomes quite an interesting challenge for when a company has a visionary approach to its products and its markets, because the algorithmic deterministic approach to the future that is typical of a 21st century thinking works very well under laboratory conditions where variables can be controlled. It works very well in short-term situations where the chances of external influences are low, such as in product development cycles that take 3 to 5 years to realise. And it works well for engineering or calculating thrusts in rocket ships. But it doesn't really work very well with all the messiness and complexities that we might call life. Now, Edward Goldsmith notes that science and technology can solve the impressive technological problems like going to the moon with machines, but the real problems we face today are of a very different order to those we faced in the 20th century. They're caused by the disintegration and breakdown of natural systems like biological organisms, families, communities, ecosystems, and atmospheric environments. Recently, the nascent human potential has been awakened by the advent of the World Wide Web, global travel and international trade. And with communication systems catalysing the global exchange of ideas at a speed and range that is unparalleled in human history, the kind of future that tomorrow's world forgot, many boundaries, geographical, political, cultural and environmental, that once defined our identities and opportunities are being transgressed. This rich transitional stage of global development is not only spanning a millennium, but is offering an opulent palette for the convergence of new technologies, diverse communities, and exploratory practices. We could consider this epoch as a neo-Renaissance, which has been 20 years in development and has been catalysed by online access, where people connect ideas, as in TED, but also generate new communities, as in TEDx, which organise around shared interests and visions of the future. And at these convergent hotspots, science is not the only discipline that can harness human potential to bring about the kinds of futures that we want to see. In the same way the Renaissance was characterised by the fusion of ideas and practices, so the Neo-Renaissance, hugely accelerated by our global connectedness, draws designers and humanities into collaborative partnerships with scientists and engineers. And throughout universities, modes of practice that engage with an idea of horizontal coupling between materials, informations, and disciplines are being forged. Their collaborative communities operate within an unevenly distributed present, which I described a bit earlier, that is open-ended, emergent, contingent, and co-constructed by its participants. 21st century science helps us realise this through a scientific framework, through the convergence of diverse practices experienced through NBIC, Nano-Bio-Info-Cognitive initiatives, with a new emphasis on STEAM, particularly from the UK government, where the contribution of arts to technological innovation is recognised and encouraged. But having listened to David Willett's speech about the 8 great technologies, I wasn't exactly sure how he was fitting the A into his vision. However, it is acknowledged in the UK as being a contributory and important factor for the development of innovative platforms. And in this age of nascent change and growing uncertainty, there is a new role to be played by creative practices and disciplines that are not sciences, but arts. New technologies alone are not enough to bring about paradigm changes in the marketplace or in practice. They must also be applied effectively and meaningfully to their audiences. And although the scientific approach has dominated futures thinking in the 20th century, the cultural conditions at the start of the 21st century do demand a different set of tactics. So it is not enough to simply consider the future as a scientific study, which is what we've done throughout the 20th century, but to use a combination of approaches that help us navigate complex challenges in many dimensions. In other words, our arts and humanities actually create the desire for change, which actually establishes a marketplace. Now, these approaches may be thought as the keystones of navigating uncertainty by engaging 3 S's. So 3 S's I'd like to talk about. Actually, I'll concentrate on the third one, but synergy, the convergence of multiple disciplines, which is what is happening around us right now. Synthesis, which is when different disciplines come alongside each other and start to dream along together and make something new. And speculation, which is actually the thing I want to concentrate on, because science has its own kind of speculation it calls a hypothesis. And I'd like to expand that into a 21st century way of thinking to actually give you more license to think in more visionary terms as being actually a credible and desirable thing to do. Now, design can construct and inhabit new ways of being without having to test or verify their immediate practicality. As designer Tim Webb observes, design is a way of walking over the landscape of possible worlds. And Fabio Sergio suggests that a new model of design is emerging that is not about creating compelling visions of perfect futures, but rather shaping those betas of presence of a future that we want to live in which technology is a material to sketch with. These fusions shape people-centered user experiences that examine social impacts, which are characteristics of meaningful design. Indeed, Bruce Sterling has been observing a growing trend where design practices have been involved in preparing audiences for systemic change. He's called this approach design fiction, which is what I referred to in the title of my talk, that provokes new possibilities through the production of diegetic objects, Okay, so diegetic objects have internal meaning that speak about another worldview, another way of doing things. And for design fiction to be effective, we must suspend our disbelief in these suggested new worlds, which Tony Dunn from the Royal College of Art suggests is the role of aesthetics. An example of this kind of practice is Future Venice, which I mentioned very briefly earlier, that proposes to grow an artificial limestone reef underneath the city using a giant natural computer consisting of droplets, very much like the ones that I showed you earlier, as a species of 21st century non-mechanical technologies that have different outcomes and impacts, say, to the Moses Gates, which are currently being constructed in the Venetian lagoon, which is like 78 mechanically, hydraulically powered, I guess, robotic King Canutes, lying underneath the water in Venice. Now, these particular droplets, these natural computers, are engineered in a way that suits a niche environment. So, for example, the droplets, like I showed you earlier, they would be designed so that they could fix carbon dioxide from the water using the minerals in the lagoon in order to create an accretion technology which gradually spreads and grows around the wood piles on which Venice stands on, which so the city's supported, as it were, on stiletto heels, and gradually spreads those, accretes, and creates a set of platform boots for the city. So it stops it from sinking into the soft delta soil so quickly on which it was founded. Now, Venice has many, 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 many environmental challenges. This is not proposed, and never was proposed, as a cure-all. It is literally, and this will be important in the discussion, it literally proposes an alternative approach that then can be engaged with. And what's interesting about this particular technology, or this particular proposal, is that already around the lagoon waterways, this accretion is happening anyway. It's being built by marine organisms that are using minerals from the lagoon to actually create these kinds of accretions. And what's even more interesting is that with this natural computer, should the environmental conditions of Venice change, and say, for example, Venice dries out rather than drowns, which is the current scenario, then as the waters subside, the material gets deposited around the wood piles and stops them rotting in the presence of air, which would be a huge undertaking to do in any other way if that scenario actually occurred. Now, what's also interesting here is that the idea that the design fiction can help us create a new space that we can develop in for the 21st century. And so design fiction itself helps a number of things happen. So it creates a context in which the technological feasibility, infrastructural requirements, ecological and cultural impact of new events and experiments that have never existed before can be discussed in an informed manner that doesn't require audiences to be experts for them to be engaged with a conversation. For example, the Future Venice project created visualizations and models using architects, technologists, ecologists, scientists, and the public were all united in discussions about a common goal. In other words, that Venice was actually something that they wanted to save, and were trying to find different ways and new ways of how they would realize that. Now, significantly, this shared ownership did not divide participants through fear relating to the possible impacts of the city by an emerging technology. In fact, during the conversations, people were actually helping each other and starting to respond to each other's conversations and suggestions. There were issues that were related to the control of the technology, but it was actually more of an epithet because the technology is little more than a smart contract concrete, and discussions revealed this eventuality that the droplets were not organisms that were going to take over the world, like grey goo, which was one of the big paranoias for nanotechnology. But actually, the design fiction and this kind of convergent forum was really potent for the public imagination and for getting designers and scientists to actually talk to each other. And using Isabel Stenger's phrase, they would dream along with the developers. In fact, the public opposition to new technologies such as nanotechnology and genetic modification is an ongoing challenge with scientific research fields where design fictions may not only help reveal the complexity of the issues, but also identify shared goals on which new relationships could build. And as Juan Enrique would say, what are the downsides of actually not attempting to develop a field of synthetic biology, for example? Future Venice also led to the research and development of blue sky scientific thinking that was applied to smart programmable droplets, which are being, at the moment, investigated as a natural computing operating system. And intellectual property rights have been raised at the University of Glasgow, notably in the development of smart paint, which proposes to eat carbon dioxide and change colour when it's full. So we know when to reapply the paint. And these carbon fixing principles have also been more broadly applied to the design of surface coatings, which is changing the view of the role of buildings. Whilst modern inert buildings negatively impact on their surroundings, the development of dynamic living surfaces creates a context in which our homes and cities could perform useful ecological functions, such as sequestering pollution and even harvesting sunlight. It's also helped us expand an idea for a range of products. So further applications of these droplets in the practice of the built environment are also being considered. For example, a droplet delivery system may serve to forge a pathway towards additional products, such as being able to heal fractures in a similar way to Henk Jonker's bacterial biocrete at the University of Delft, and also as living insulation material to help improve the energy efficiency of buildings. And these proposals are still in the design phase. Indicators of new markets. The conversations and public engagement that we've held with research groups and also in public has helped us also identify a need maybe for these droplets to act as pollution sequestrants in the Venice lagoon and also in other wastewater systems. So, for example, smart droplets may be used to clean up environmental waste toxins like cyanide by keeping the metabolisms in their bodies and becoming a leaky container for the distribution of these systems, and converting them into thiocyanide, which can be absorbed into the natural ecological systems. The other thing that Future Venice and these kinds of practices were helping us realise is that we were building and shaping our audiences, so that design fiction is more than simply entertainment, as Bruce Sterling proposes, but actually prepares audiences for change, where it becomes an active conversation, where its ideas and proposals are reflected back on contemporary practice. And in this context, design fiction becomes a method and an instrument of change and challenges us to reflect on what is scientifically possible by expanding the possibility of developing new approaches. Indeed, it enables us to see a whole new world of opportunity by suspending disbelief of what we believe to be possible right now, and creates a different kind of space to imagine different kinds of outcomes in different fields, and ultimately it builds and shapes audiences through these relationships. Audience engagement in these visions actually also helps them come true. Particularly through sharing a lot of these ideas on in social media, which ultimately conducts a kind of market research for us. We can see exactly what ideas are really popular, and it also helps us identify where the next set of diegetic objects and products could potentially be placed for us to have necessary conversations to help us build a vision of the kinds of I guess products, relationships, communities that we'd like to be involved in. So ultimately, this really gives us access to a probabilistic future, not as a woolly shape of anything goes, but something that actually really, starts to take on a very distinct character. And it's one that we can bring about, but it also needs its audiences, its markets, to be creative and get engaged in the process. And this isn't a top-down exchange. This is something that is very, very two-way. Indeed, I think this neo-Renaissance is helping us realise that the potential that lies within our changing world can be engaged by finding the right kinds of methods and opportunities, maybe by using the 3 S's that I suggested. And as Warren Ellis observes, reality as we know it is exploding with novelty every day. Rather than trying to ramrod everything into something that we've predicted through an algorithm, he's asking us to, observe, I guess, the inherent creativity of the world that we're in. But he cautions that not all of it's good. It's a strange and not entirely comfortable time to be alive. So at the start of the 21st century, despite the uncertainty around us, we do find ourselves at a radically creative juncture that's actually encouraging new kinds of practices and social organisations. So we may use design fiction avatars, emerging technologies, and convergent practices to navigate the 21st century. And we may get to a point of realisation where we understand that the future didn't go anywhere. It's just simply evolved. Thank you.
Okay, happy to take some questions.
I'm totally happy to take some questions.
Does anybody have any questions for Rachel? That's a very interesting talk. Okay, well, I'd like to kick off with one.
Yeah.
Early on in your presentation, you mentioned that the vast majority of truly disruptive technologies are brought to the market by startups and not by established companies.
Yes, that's.
Can you just give me a bit of insight into why you think that is?
That's Steve Jurvetson's insight from Fisher Draper Jurvetson, and essentially he invests in I guess disruptive technologies, and it's been his observation that essentially big companies aren't coming up with the disruptive solutions, that they tend either to buy them out or that it's happening through startups.
So would you not class the iPad and the iPod from Apple as a disruptive technology in its way?
I guess it depends what you mean by disruption is one, and I am quoting from Steve Jurvetson. Yeah.
Actually, the iPod was not designed at Apple.
No, I know the MP3 player.
Yeah.
No, the iPod was not designed at Apple. It was actually designed by a startup, which was bought out by Apple.
So I guess the answer is they don't need to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you sum up from the presentation that portraying the 21st century more of an eco type of environment? The reality is that we just get more material things, don't we? Just mentioned the iPod, everything seems to be more of a material.
Well, I guess when I use the term ecology, it's actually, I guess, the metaphor for the framework of thinking, rather than saying we are now more ecological. So that in some ways, the machine is a metaphor as well as being a real thing. A machine is a way of thinking about a series of objects that we secondarily connect together, and that's the way we try and go from A to B. Whereas if we think in the terms of the metaphor of ecology, which is things that are connected, there are many routes. It's really the framework for thinking. And I don't think one is better than the other. I think my point really is about when we're trying to achieve something, we can actually change the tool and the lens that we're using to try and observe our progress or look at opportunities. That then I think, by diversifying a tool set for thinking, I think helps us identify something that's actually meaningful to us. I'm not suggesting that everybody goes away and throws all their classical science textbooks away and starts to I don't know, become a follower of Albert Laszlo Barabasi or anything. But it's really to diversify the way that we're thinking about what we're doing, taking a step back, and what the future is. What are we actually talking about here? I mean, we're assuming certain things about what the future is, and I'm just really asking about, well, actually, how we think. What is the future? I mean, because the future, does it really exist? I mean, you could argue that there is really no future per se. There's just this, completely continuous emerging present, because we never really know the future. And the future only exists when we look backwards and say, oh, well, we're in the future now, and that's the past. Because there's no way of evidencing a future. So, I mean, all future, it talks about the future, are speculative. And if we're going to speculate, why not get creative about it? And I think one of the problems that science has is that, our hypotheses try to be as simple and as narrow as possible, because there is a disciplinary culture which says, you can't be too wacky. Because that's the label that you get. And yet, sometimes, placing your marker completely outside of what is expected helps you not do that thing over there, but actually, so the flying car isn't about a flying car. It's actually about a conversation about transport. And what about our priorities, and where this transport is taking place, and who is getting involved. And and actually I think that this builds relationships a lot better than saying, well, we're going to have one of them. I mean, having one of them, if it's really, really, really beautiful, I mean, that's a desire that people want to buy, and it fits in with a particular kind of thinking about the future. But I think there are other ways of, I guess, building loyalty, creating an identity around a portfolio of I guess, more ideas than products. And the products can be placed within those conversations, but effectively they are diegetic objects that are talking about, possibilities that then become co-constructed by consumers and marketplaces and universities and other forms of communication and audiences.
A couple of things. How do you balance, you mentioned IP at one point, there's some IP in that.
Yeah.
How do you balance the kind of more visionary 21st century thinking, as you described it, with the constraints and the kind of capitalist use of those technologies? So
I think we'll see parallel worlds. I don't think it's one or the other. I think what the open source visionary thinking does, it creates the context. I think that ultimately, with the current marketplace, you still have to protect your IP. So I mean that they coexist. They coexist, and it is really about negotiating with the partners and the people that are involved. And I wish there was a big general formula I could come up with, but I don't think it's that at all. It's about the cultures of the organisations and the people that you're working with. I don't think they're mutually exclusive either. I think that there is a certain there's a certain amount of community that you can build, that people want a piece of that community. And so whether that community is simply by people creating, I guess, either a consultancy or a kind of a source of ideas that people come towards, or whether they're actually creating a thing, I think both of those so I guess you don't put IP on a kind of a name, brand, or reputation, but there is a kind of IP with it, and I think those two things, I think they work simultaneously, work together.
And just reflecting on your future Venice concept.
Yes.
What it is. I mean, do you think that kind of what you've described as 20th century thinking has come from the fact that public resistance to interfering, seen to be interfering with nature, drives science and technology to produce things that are inanimate and inert and do something by some other means, rather than putting something into the water that will generate something that looks natural but is a human interference with?
I think, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's a cultural issue, and then there's an English professor called Timothy Morton, who has written something called Ecology Without Nature, and essentially, I mean, he's a typical postmodernist, so he deconstructs the idea of nature and says, okay, you know, our idea of nature within cities is having like a little green lawn on the top of a very tall building. Is that nature? But what he's actually doing is he's asking us to think about the materiality that actually exists and works with that in a much more objective way by deconstructing a lot of these ideas about, romantic vistas, which is actually what we're trying to create when we look outside office windows. We've got pot plants, we're framing nature. So he's kind of asking us to really think about what it is that we mean by that. And I think there will be a cultural shift. I mean, I think synthetic biology has a big challenge because of genetic modification has, I don't know, it's like demon seed really for plants. But I think that by just presenting a thing without a context, I think creates a lot of challenges for people culturally. And that's why Future Venice was successful in the sense that it created a setting, a crisis and a context that people actually cared about, and then says, okay, if we actually could do anything, and here's something that we could use in the portfolio, people started actually asking questions about that. Whereas I found that working with the synthetic biologists, with Autodesk, it's very much, well, this is the thing that we've got, and it can make this, and it can make something else. And when it comes to a public discussion, people don't want to know. They see that it's genetically modified, and they're scared. I have no idea why. Probably because of too many Michael Crichton movies, but there is a cultural shift, and there is a place for all of these things. And I think probably the main message is context. We need to pay attention to context, because probably all things that we are doing are relevant and most relevant in certain contexts, and helping people be aware of that, and aware of the challenges that we face when we're proposing certain interventions, I think really, it creates a different kind of relationship. And for me, I found that the partnerships that I've been working in have really benefited from that.
You mentioned there about designology helping to stimulate discussion in the vision of the future, but genetic modification in that is where I suppose it's also been used to create a negative.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, so there's been a run of bio-art installations that have been deliberately used to provoke, the dystopian kinds of contexts. And I think that that's why I think that strategic design. It's like industry. You can have good and you can have bad design. You can have good and you can have bad industry. So yes, it's a powerful tool. So you've got to be careful about your message. You have to be honest about what it is that you're exchanging and the kinds of issues that are involved. You can't be dishonest about it. I think that's one of Bruce Sterling's cautions, that design fiction can be very dishonest. There was a hoax that was created by Stingray shoes. And they said that they were going to breed genetically modified stingray of different colours and different patterns if you went online and you chose your design and sent it off to somewhere in the East, and then it would come back as your shoes. But it actually got both scientists and designers very upset. So I'm not into panaceas. Design fiction is not a panacea. It's a tool. And it depends very much how you use it as to how effective it's going to be in helping you, innovate, helping you engage with new audiences, helping you, I guess, beta phase and, develop a product or an idea further.